In 1938, an amazing expedition set out to explore a remote, sacred land beyond the Himalayas, Tibet.
The expedition was an extraordinary achievement. Those months they spent in that strange land, opening it up.
The explorers were a team of elite Nazi scientists, led by a glamorous adventurer.
He was the Indiana Jones of the Third Reich.
Dispatched on a mission by the most feared man in Nazi Germany, Heinrich Himmler. His quest was as audacious as it was ambitious. To find evidence that linked German Aryans to the ancient super race of a lost empire.
If only Tibet could yield up, the land of the snows could yield up its secrets.
This is Himmler's quest to find the fabled lost people of Atlantis. In 1936, one of Nazi Germany's rising stars, 26-year-old zoologist Ernst Schaefer, was officially summoned to SS headquarters in Berlin. He had an appointment with the most powerful and feared man in the Third Reich. Not Adolf Hitler, but Heinrich Himmler. As Reichsführer, Himmler commanded an elite SS paramilitary force 250,000 strong, a black-clad army dedicated to the supremacy of the German race. He was chief of all police throughout Germany, including the secret police, the brutal Gestapo. Himmler organized the arrest and detention of Jews as controller of a growing number of concentration camps.
The SS was a huge set of tentacles reach out into Germany, and they're SS tentacles, and Himmler is chief of them.
Now Himmler's tentacles were reaching out to envelop the young scientist Ernst Schaefer. Himmler wanted him to solve a problem. The Nazis claimed that the Germans were the master race, destined to rule. This ideology justified the Germans' domination of Europe and hatred of the Jews. Himmler needed German superiority to be proved a fact. For his proof, he turned to an ancient myth, the lost world of Atlantis. Atlantis was described as a vast continent in the Atlantic Ocean. Its people were elite humans who conquered and dominated all other cultures and races. The empire of Atlantis reached into Europe, Africa, and South America. But for Himmler, Atlantis wasn't a story, but historical fact.
So Atlantis, he came to believe, Himmler, had actually existed. It wasn't a myth, but it was also scientifically based. There had been an Atlantis.
Getting evidence that the descendants of the Atlanteans were none other than the German people wasn't easy. The island of Atlantis disappeared in a day and a night. It was destroyed by earthquakes and volcanoes, consumed by the ocean, and lost beneath the waves forever. Far from the Atlantean civilization being lost in the cataclysm, Himmler believed it lived on. He held that Atlantis gave birth to every great civilization: the Greeks, the Romans, the Mayans and Aztecs of South America, even the ancient Egyptians. That these inferior peoples had been bequeathed their culture by the superior people of Atlantis.
From the very beginning, it's all to do with race. Racism impregnates the Atlantis myth. It's about a superior race of beings who spread this knowledge around the world.
Himmler had a specific mission for Schaefer. He was to lead an SS scientific expedition and bring him proof that German Aryans were the descendants of this superior race, the lost people of Atlantis. Himmler had chosen Schaefer in particular for this task, not only for his scientific credentials, but because he was already a famous explorer. In 1930s Germany, Dr. Ernst Schaefer cut a heroic figure. He'd been a member of 2 American-led expeditions into Tibet. He was a fastidious scientist and passionate hunter who loved to study mammals and birds in the wild, and after he'd shot them. An ambitious self-publicist, he wrote books about his exploits as a young sharpshooting adventurer. They made him a celebrity in Germany.
He becomes, for Germans, an embodiment of the ideal German in a way. I think that's how Himmler regarded him. A sort of heroic, brave, physically resourceful. The cliché would be Indiana Jones, the Indiana Jones of the Third Reich.
Ernst Schaefer was the ideal person to lead the SS scientific expedition into Tibet. Himmler pledged him his personal support. Himmler told Schaefer that in ancient times, survivors of Atlantis had founded a great civilization in Asia. One mysterious country least diluted by the centuries of history was remote Tibet.
For Heinrich Himmler, Tibet had an extraordinary appeal. The supermen of the Aryan race had gone there and in the fastness of Tibet had re-established their culture and their ways, cut off, remote from the outside world.
In the 1930s, Tibet was one of the few scientifically unresearched areas of the world. Situated in the center of Asia, but isolated by the Himalayan mountains, the Tibetan plateau covers nearly 1 million square miles at an altitude of up to 15,000 feet. Could this natural fortress have sheltered survivors of Atlantis? If they did settle there, then the isolation would have kept them racially pure. They would be distant cousins of the German master race.
If Tibet could be reopened and the evidence of the supermen of the past be rediscovered, here was the best proof possible of the validity of the argument that modern Germany and the Nazi movement and the Aryans of Germany now were directly related to the supermen.
Tibet at this point in time was so unexplored compared to other regions of the world that any expedition to Tibet would be a big coup.
To lead his own expedition into Tibet was a dream come true for the ambitious Schaefer. But there was a sting in the tail. Doing science for the SS meant doing it the SS way. In 1935, Himmler set up the Ahnenerbe, a research organization within the SS. Its job was to prove Nazi ideology.
The idea is to help a number of German scientists dig into the past of the German peoples and in a way to endorse them as the superior people of Europe.
The Ahnenerbe recruited corrupt scientists and scholars prepared to ransack Germany's past and glorify it.
We would say that Ahnenerbe is an attempt to rewrite history. Himmler claimed it was a rediscovery of the true German history. And that's why all aspects of archaeology, philology, semantics, language, you name it, any ology or onomy, it had to be taken into Ahnenerbe because those elements could become means by which the truth of the great German past could be rediscovered.
What is remarkable is that the German state of the time, the Nazi state, certainly according to the SS chief Heinrich Himmler, needed to create its own mythologies.
The ancient swastika symbol was appropriated to represent Nazi power and signify their hatred of what they saw as inferior peoples. The Ahnenerbe also undermined what it saw as anti-German science. Even the great Einstein, because he was Jewish.
German nationalists resented the achievements of Jewish scientists, and they came up with an absurd idea that their science was in some way Jewish and therefore not wanted in Germany. And this did force them to validate science that was really very mediocre, if not absurd.
Schaefer's scientific pride faced an even bigger challenge. Himmler's quasi-historical account of Atlantis, backed by the Ahnenerbe's pseudoscience, was to him a fantasy without foundation. As a scientist, he didn't believe a word of it. Schaefer thought that he could ride the Nazi tiger, and that this expedition would ensure a glittering scientific career.
I think he was quite ambitious in many ways, but also very much willing to manipulate people, willing to manipulate institutions, so that he would get what he wanted.
Desperate to return to Tibet, Schaefer couldn't resist Himmler's offer. So Schaefer made a devil's pact with Himmler. To realize his ambition, he agreed to an impossible task. And ultimately, he would pay a heavy price. Ernst Schaefer was a political animal, always able to manipulate a situation to his advantage. Or so he thought. In 1933, Schaefer had been studying for his doctorate when Hitler was elected Reichschancellor of Germany and the Nazis swept to power. The Nazis' racial policies caused many Jews to leave the country, as did many scientific researchers. But Schaefer embraced the new order and signed up to Himmler's increasingly powerful SS. In Nazi Germany, that's how ambitious young scientists got ahead.
It was actually very sensible of Schaefer to join the SS in 1933. He was ambitious. He had unusual ambitions. He didn't just want a university seat. He wanted support for his work as a naturalist. He rightly believed that the SS would back him.
He himself said that politics serves science and science serves politics. If he could make that illusion himself, then it would justify and explain why he was so willing, so ready to join a political movement, because it gave him the scientific freedom to pursue the researches that he believed was his mission.
But Schaefer found the realities of mixing politics and science impossible from the start. Schaefer's meticulous scientific methods would never chime with Himmler's bizarre cut-and-paste theories. So while Schaefer benefited from official SS support, he also suffered from official SS interference. The Ahnenerbe plied him with its preferred candidates to join the SS expedition to Tibet. Corrupt archaeologists, self-styled mystics, and pseudoscientists.
Now, the Ahnenerbe is very curious because there are some genuine scientists working for it. They're probably rather embarrassed. But there are some cranks as well. You have a fellow called Willigut, or Weisthor, who is literally insane. And yet, Himmler regards him as a kind of guru, as a wise man. People like Schaefer, they're appalled when they stumble on people like Willigut. You can imagine their reaction, what am I doing here with people like this?
Pseudoscience was anathema to the rigorous and ambitious Schaefer. Risking Himmler's wrath, Schaefer rejected the Ahnenerbe's candidates.
Schaefer was able to resist some of the more overt pressure that Himmler was putting on him. Schaefer also was able to keep his distance from the Ahnenerbe, the ancestral heritage, as such, and be semi-independent, really, of all of it.
Schaefer's vision was very different and very clear. He wanted to conduct an objective scientific survey of Tibet, a comprehensive study of its terrain and wildlife, of its people and their customs. It was a holistic approach to science ahead of its time. The great naturalist Charles Darwin had the Galapagos Islands. Ernst Schaefer would have Tibet.
Schaefer and a number of other European naturalists believed that the Himalayas were a kind of source point for many different species, if not all species in the world. So to go to the Himalayas, which is where Tibet is, was a means of going back to the source, of understanding how species developed and spread across the world.
There was a theory that Tibet was essentially like a sort of waterfall of species, and that there was something interesting happening there genetically.
Schaefer wrote a manifesto describing the kind of men he wanted to take with him.
An ideologically homogeneous, healthy team, comradeship according to soldierly principles, in which each member possesses, in addition to his sound knowledge of his subject, of which he is a master, also as much versatility as possible.
Schaefer wanted true scientists, but he was still playing a political game. Himmler wanted each scientist to have one vital qualification: membership of the SS.
There were plenty of academics in this period who were not members of the SS. So I think Schaefer took a lot of SS members partly because that brought prestige, partly that made sure that Himmler would not necessarily withdraw his patronage.
To achieve his vision of pure scientific research, Schaefer himself would go as zoologist, ornithologist, botanist, and of course team leader. As team geologist, he chose 24-year-old Karl Wienert, and as entomologist, 38-year-old Ernst Krause.
There was one member of the expedition was interested in Tibetan insects, butterflies and so on. Another member of the expedition was meticulously taking geomagnetic readings at different points across the Himalayas. I don't think you can really say there is a Nazi kind of butterfly collector, or that there is anything political about geomagnetism.
But Schaefer couldn't ignore Himmler's quest to find evidence of an ancient Nordic invasion of Tibet. So he did accept one Ahnenerbe candidate onto his team, 26-year-old anthropologist Bruno Beger.
When you come to Bruno Beger, the expedition anthropologist, I think you are looking at a political scientific research project, which is to investigate the connections between the peoples of the Himalayas and Europeans.
Deciphering a person's racial heritage was Beger's speciality. He'd been trained to do this by measuring people. Skull shape and facial features were thought by racial anthropologists to be particularly important. They separated what they saw as the superior Aryan race from the inferior races.
Bruno Beger had done some research on racial theories and racial mixing in particular. He had worked with Heinrich Günther, who was a very famous big shot amongst racial scientists in the Third Reich.
Schaefer realized racial anthropology was essential to the success of his expedition. He needed Beger. He was the only person who might find the evidence Himmler had asked him to provide.
Beger and Schaefer at this point both really believe in a lot of the ideas that are around in National Socialist Germany. They do primarily see themselves as scientists in their future careers, really. The problem with that, however, of course, is that science and politics are very, very closely linked in Nazi Germany. You can't have science without the politics.
Himmler believed they would produce enough evidence to justify the expedition itself, and it would add to his dream of recreating a German culture linked very directly to the Aryan past.
Schaefer had his team in place. After a year of preparation, he was ready to lead his expedition into Tibet. But his timing couldn't have been worse. By the spring of 1938, Europe was in political turmoil. The German war machine was gearing up. The Nazis had reoccupied the Rhineland taken from Germany at the end of the First World War, and now marched into German-speaking Austria, the first steps to a greater Germany. The international situation didn't stop Schaefer's expedition setting out from Berlin on April the 19th, 1938. But it could stop him getting to Tibet. War in Asia left Schaefer only one possible route to Tibet, through India. And this brought him into direct conflict with the British Empire. Tibet was a nominally independent country, ruled in the absence of the young Dalai Lama by a regent and a council of ministers. The British ensured they were the only Europeans allowed to advise the Tibetan government.
The British at this point in time weren't really that keen on allowing Schaefer into Tibet. However, that wasn't necessarily completely uncharacteristic. The British had never been particularly keen on allowing foreign expeditions into Tibet. The Tibetan government itself was also never particularly keen on allowing anyone other than the British into Tibet.
Schaefer nevertheless sailed via the Suez Canal for India. In this sensitive situation, he played down the SS support for his expedition to avoid antagonizing the British. But a Nazi newspaper ran a glowing article celebrating the expedition's glorious SS connections. Before Schaefer even arrived, British and Indian newspapers burst into print, with headlines screaming, "Gestapo agent in India." They were accused of being German spies. It was a disaster for Schaefer. The British authorities didn't give the German expedition permission even to enter India. The precious expedition Schaefer had prepared for all his life was over before it had even started. Again, Himmler's personal support was crucial. He wrote a bitter letter of complaint to Britain, read by the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain.
You know yourself that up to now my attitude towards every Englishman who has come to Germany has been entirely friendly. For that reason, I am the more astonished that the English should treat one of my men in a brusque, wounding and unfriendly way. I cannot imagine the authorities are so stupid as to see in the scientist Dr. Schaefer, officially dispatched by me, a spy.
Despite the gathering pace of Nazi Germany's war machine, Britain was still trying to appease Hitler. So after Himmler's intervention, the British backed down.
Appeasement is the big word of the time, that Britain has accepted that avoidance of war is the prime consideration, and therefore wants amicable relations, as far as they can be achieved, with Germany.
The British eventually gave Schaefer permission to go into northern India, to explore the remote province of Sikkim. but he was expressly forbidden to enter Tibet without official leave. Schaefer was not a man to take no for an answer, but he had to take what he could get, for the time being. Once in Sikkim, Schaefer expanded his operation, hiring porters and pack horses, buying food and equipment. Despite being forbidden to enter Tibet, Schaefer also hired Tibetan speakers. As close as possible to the Tibet border, Schaefer set his team to work on their varied scientific research, collecting data for his scientific survey and also for Himmler's quest for European traits he believed would racially link the German people to the Atlantean super race. Sikkim became a place of great interest to Bega.
There are many people in northern India who are descended from Tibetans, so Bega had a lot to start with.
For an anthropologist and ethnologist like Bega, the races of this remote area were fascinating. As Schaefer noted,
nearly all these fragment tribes have preserved their own cultures and their own languages and are distinguished by well-marked racial characteristics.
Bega made meticulous measurements, compared eye color to a chart, and compared hair color to graded samples. No detail was too small or obscure for his specialist equipment to measure.
He'd brought a vast array of scientific instruments, which could all be ordered from scientific mail catalogues in the Third Reich, really. One particularly outlandish instrument that he brought was an instrument designed to measure the curvature of fingernails, for instance.
Racial anthropologists measured racial identity and status in the shape of the skeleton, and in particular, the skull. The cephalic index was the ratio between the breadth and depth of the head. A long, narrow Teutonic head indicated North European ancestry.
He would measure the ratio between your forehead and your nose, the distance between your eyebrows, and all sorts of very intricate measurements. And although it seems rather crude now, he is in a way measuring your genetic inheritance.
If they could prove by physical measurement of the head and the face and so on, that indeed the Tibetans were a direct link physically with modern Germans, then the link between the Supermen notion settled in the Shangri-La of Tibet and modern Germany would be made.
Bega's expert measurements of the short, dark-skinned, black-haired peoples of Sikkim would struggle to find evidence for Himmler's fantasy of the superhuman, blonde, blue-eyed conquerors of Tibet. Himmler wanted evidence of a dominant strain of people. In his mind, these would naturally form the upper class, the Tibetan ruling elite.
He's particularly interested in Tibetan aristocrats in Lhasa, and he wants to find a connection between the Tibetan elite and Nordic people.
But the British had condemned Schaefer to fester in Sikkim. As weeks turned into months, he realized his expedition was doomed to fail if they couldn't get over the Tibetan border. He wrote in his diary,
"We are at Tibet's frontier. It is the realm of our most powerful yearning. Up there, not far away at all, is the border pass."
The border haunted Schaefer's imagination. There was nothing physically to stop him.
There are neither guards nor sentinels, neither barrier nor gates. At that lonely altitude, there is only an oboe, a heap of stones wrapped in prayer flags.
Schaefer, in desperation, was even considering sneaking over the border. If he did, he risked more damaging anti-Nazi headlines and an international incident. But if he didn't, he'd face Himmler's fury.
No one on the expedition wants to go back to Germany, having not got to Tibet. So for Schaefer, this is a crisis moment.
He'd put up a massive expedition, put a lot of personal effort and investment into all of this.
Somehow he has to cross the Himalayas. Otherwise he's going to lose face in Germany. He doesn't want to be humiliated.
Schaefer was torn. He felt honor bound to resist the temptation.
I have promised the Viceroy not to cross the Tibetan border without official leave. And as a German, I'm not willing to break a promise. But what does official leave mean?
Schaefer was looking for a way to wriggle out of his promise to the British. And he was in luck. One day, Bega noticed a rather well-dressed Tibetan riding past the camp. He recorded the event in his diary.
Suddenly, a Tibetan appeared. My next thought is to measure him. Then our native translator whispers to us that this is a high official.
Here was an important advisor to a man of influence. Tering Raja, a Tibetan prince who ruled the province just over the forbidden border. Schaefer seized the opportunity to ingratiate himself with the Tibetan ruling class. The charm offensive might be his first step on the road to Lhasa. The team got off to a good start, observing Tibetan protocols as they served tea. Schaefer, they made out, was a great and powerful leader. Schaefer, in his turn, spoke of his love of Tibet and how he yearned to see Lhasa, and they showered their honored guest with gifts. Schaefer gave him a begging letter in Tibetan to take to his master, Tering Raja. He hoped the prince might intercede with the ruling council to let him enter Tibet. It was a slim hope, and all Schaefer could do was wait. As the summer of 1938 slipped into autumn, Schaefer remained isolated on the India-Tibet border. It seemed that the British had won. He was trapped. Then, after 5 months of waiting, a letter from Lhasa.
To the German Herr Dr. Schaefer, Master of 100 Sciences.
First, the ruling council declared that Tibet is forever prohibited to foreigners. But then the letter took on a more friendly tone.
It nevertheless appears from your letter that you intend only friendship and to see the Holy Land and its religious institutions.
Then at last the translator read the news they thought would never come.
We grant you permission to enter Lhasa and stay there for 14 days.
The elation was indescribable. All 5 German scientists were invited by the Tibetan ruling council to visit Lhasa for 2 weeks. Schaefer had wriggled out of his promise to the British. Here was the longed-for official leave.
It was pretty spectacular getting these German scientists into Lhasa.
Getting into Lhasa was a big propaganda coup, really, for Nazi Germany. Particularly so since the Nazis did, at this point in time, make a lot out of the fact that Germans could supposedly deal with non-European peoples better than the British.
With news of the historic invitation, Himmler promoted the whole team. Schaefer to the rank of Hauptsturmführer, a captain, in the SS. On January the 19th, 1939, Schaefer saw the Dalai Lama's vast Potala Palace towering over Lhasa. It was an historic occasion. They were the first Germans ever to enter the holy city. The Tibetan government had officially invited Schaefer, so he expected a grand welcome. But just a single official greeted them. A British representative in Lhasa had intervened and changed the ruling council's minds. Schaefer's great coup would soon turn to abject failure if the nobles of Lhasa ignored his expedition. Now Schaefer the politician got to work. Showing due deference, he lavished the finest gifts on the ministers and nobility of Lhasa.
What Schaefer did in Lhasa, there was definitely a fair bit of politics. Schaefer was trying to build up friendly relations with the Tibetan government. Up until that point in time, the Tibetan government had only really dealt with the British government.
Schaefer paid particular attention to the regent, Rating Rinpoche, the ruler of Tibet. Schaefer found he had a unique advantage over the British in getting close to the Tibetans. Germany and Tibet, he told them, shared a common bond: the swastika. For centuries, Tibetans had regarded the ancient symbol as a sign of good fortune and permanence. Schaefer made gifts of Nazi emblems, explaining to his hosts how revered the symbol was in Germany. The Tibetans were delighted, not knowing that in Europe at that very moment, the swastika was a symbol of oppression and violence. With this deception, Schaefer scored another great political coup.
The regent later on sent a letter back home to Hitler, addressing him as the German king, and asked for more contact between Germany and Tibet and friendly relations.
To His Majesty Adolf Hitler, I have pleasure to let Your Majesty know that Dr. Schaefer and his party, who are the first Germans to visit Tibet, have been allowed without any objection, and every necessary assistance is rendered on their arrival.
Thanks to Schaefer's access, the ruling council gave the Germans unprecedented freedom to film Lhasa, its monasteries and medieval setting. Schaefer and his team documented the exotic streets and markets with their rich variety of food and cloth and jewelry. But Schaefer's personal research was suffering. The wonderful letter from Lhasa had also imposed a terrible condition that struck at the heart of why Schaefer was in Tibet at all: hunting. It was a bitter blow. Schaefer had traveled halfway round the world only to be banned from collecting wildlife for his own research. Well, not quite. Schaefer did manage to hunt, but quietly, mainly with a catapult and only the occasional bullet, when no one was about.
Schaefer, of course, did really circumvent some of the conditions, although not in a very ostentatious manner.
Beger's work also suffered a severe setback. During the colourful New Year festival, as Schaefer and the team filmed the magnificent dances and parades, they got too close with their cameras and were stoned and injured by angry monks. After that, Beger's work measuring people was considered by the team to be provocative and foolhardy. A frustrated Beger saw an extraordinary variety of people slip through his fingers. Shaven-headed monks in dark red robes, burly yak herders dressed in heavy sheepskin, delicate officials in shimmering chubas, and what he described as many beautiful and tall people with even features. He couldn't gather any hard physiological data, that might fulfill Himmler's quest. Yet while the science expedition was stalled, the Germans remained great friends of the regent. He extended the expedition's stay from 2 weeks to 2 months. Schaefer had sidelined the British, much to their annoyance.
Well, the British were worried partly that Schaefer would be able to stoke up anti-British sentiment in Tibet. In fact, this becomes more and more of an issue throughout 1939 as appeasement in Europe started to fail.
In September 1938, in a spirit of appeasement, the British had brokered the Munich Agreement and let Nazi Germany occupy the largely German-speaking Sudetenland, then part of Czechoslovakia. But 2 months later came Kristallnacht, one night of violence by brown shirts and civilians that left 91 Jews dead and 30,000 in concentration camps. The true nature of Nazism had been revealed. The time for appeasement was over. The Germans still enjoyed official approval. His team were allowed to leave Lhasa to explore the holiest places in Tibet, banned even to the British. But as they explored the sacred Yarlung Valley east of Lhasa, they began to receive messages urging them to return home to Germany.
Schaefer was keen to stay and explore areas that hadn't been explored by many other people, just to make his expedition special, just to really enable him to use what he was doing to obtain fame, really, back in Germany.
A European war seemed increasingly likely, even inevitable. If they waited much longer, they risked being interned by the British as enemy aliens. The expedition was running out of time. By March 1939, Nazi Germany had expanded east again to occupy Bohemia and Moravia. But Britain had a mutual assistance pact with Poland, and any further German advance into Poland could not be so easily ignored. Europe was on the brink of war. Even the ebullient Schaefer was becoming increasingly anxious about British intentions and began to fear arrest and detention in India. Bager reported that in the summer of 1939, Schaefer received a letter from his father and was so deeply affected by it that he disappeared for an hour.
His father pointed out there's a war coming, and he said to the son, if I were you, I would make the best of what you've had and return.
If Schaefer wanted a chance of actually getting all his samples and specimens and data back to Germany and make something out of them and make a name for himself, he really needed to leave before war broke out.
Bager wrote that he and the others were also being warned they were in danger.
We sat around the fireplace and discussed it. Suddenly we realized a letter and transmission from Berlin had the same message. My wife had been hinting too.
The war, they were told, would start after the summer. That was only weeks away. It was time to go home to Germany. Despite the rising political tension and Schaefer's fears of capture and detention, the team were allowed safe passage through India by the British. The 5 SS officers were even able to fly out of Calcutta with British Indian Airways. But what would Himmler have to say about Schaefer's lack of evidence for his quest for the people of Atlantis? And what might he do? Even worse, when the team touched down in Munich, Heinrich Himmler himself would be there waiting. Now would come the reckoning. But Himmler welcomed Schaefer and his team as heroes.
Here were fine young men, great scientists, you could call them, or young Germans at their best. It showed them opening up the world, or restoring the evidence, looking for the evidence, being adventurous, giving Germany that sense of encompassing some of the best virtues and values of a modern civilization linked to the Aryan past. That they didn't make the link in physical hard terms, in a sense, didn't matter. The expedition in itself was its own justification.
Himmler was elated by Schaefer's achievements. In Tibet, he had trounced the British and proven German dominance in the region.
The propaganda value of the expedition was definitely greater than the scientific value of the expedition. Himmler certainly was delighted by the outcome, shaking the expedition members' hands at the airport.
Just 27 days later, Nazi Germany, fatally committed to its policy of territorial and racial domination, invaded Poland. The Second World War began. Schaefer was not yet 30 when he returned to Germany a national hero. But what had his extraordinary expedition to Tibet actually achieved? Schaefer's personal scientific vision came to nothing. Most of the huge amount of data his hand-picked team of scientists gathered lay unexamined and then lost in the tumult of war. What of the proof of the super race of Atlantis? It seems Himmler had asked the wrong guys. He'd certainly asked the wrong question. Even racial anthropologist Bruno Beger had found the Atlantis Nordic idea hard to swallow.
Beger was trying to find out what kind of racial mixture there was in Tibet. I don't think Beger's research was as grand as believing the Nordic race had changed all of Asian history.
Bruno Beger said that when they were gathered round the campfire in northern India or Tibet, they would reminisce about some of Himmler's stranger views and laugh about them.
But these men, as SS scientists, were supporting Nazi ideology, working with a man whose crimes were beyond imagining.
Heinrich Himmler, let's not forget he was a super efficient bureaucrat who created a state within a state that carried out the worst genocide in human history. So we shouldn't reduce him to an eccentric or a crank.
Himmler, to avoid trial for his crimes and death by hanging, committed suicide after the war. In February 1943, Beger was sent to Auschwitz to make facial masks of prisoners. Soon afterwards, 109 Jews he had worked on were gassed for an infamous Nazi project, the Jewish Skull Collection. In 1971, Beger was tried and convicted as an accomplice to murder. He received a 3-year suspended sentence. After the war, Schaefer's glittering career evaporated. He took a job creating a wildlife park in Venezuela, one of the sanctuaries for Nazis in South America. Schaefer's life was cursed by his membership of the SS and close association with the evil Heinrich Himmler. The Salzkammergut Lake District in Austria is known as the Devil's Dustbin. At the end of World War II, rumors spread that the Nazis came here to hide Europe's plundered gold.
Gold oiled Hitler's war machine. Gold was essential to Hitler.
As the Allies closed in, the Nazis started hiding their loot wherever they could.
I saw them throwing the boxes into the lake.
And there's one lake so deep and so remote that it's said to have been the Nazis' favorite dumping site, Lake Toplitz. The stories of what's been dubbed the Nazis' El Dorado have obsessed treasure hunters for the last 70 years.
Man stops thinking logically when it comes to gold.
When a team of divers explored Lake Toplitz for the first time,
On the monitor, I could see there's something there.
they didn't discover gold, but something every bit as extraordinary. The dying days of World War II. Hitler was in his bunker, unable to accept defeat. But most Nazis knew the game was up. It was time to start hiding evidence of their crimes. A unit of SS officers were instructed to transport boxes to the Salzkammergut Lake District in the Austrian Alps. But their mission ground to a halt. The road didn't go as far as the lake they'd been instructed to reach. They needed alternative transport to get their secret cargo to its destination, Lake Toplitz. Ida Weisenbacher was 21 years old when the SS woke her grandfather demanding assistance.
At 5 a.m. they called, and straight away they were at the door, the two SS men. They needed a horse and cart to get to Lake Toplitz. And then my grandfather said, that's not possible. The horses haven't been fed yet. No, they needed the horse and cart. It was really important. You've got to harness the horses.
Ida Weisenbacher was terrified for her life and quickly followed instructions.
They said it has to be done quickly. The boxes have to go to Lake Toplitz.
But Ida noticed something that puzzled her. The boxes weren't all the same.
There were heavy ones and light ones. They were different, big and small. The small ones were heavy, really heavy.
Ida asked what was in the heavy boxes, but was met with a stony silence.
The SS man who came with me didn't give anything away. I asked, where are you from? He wouldn't tell me anything. It was all very strict. Everything had to disappear in great secrecy.
Ida made the journey 3 times, and when they got to the lake the second time, she witnessed something bizarre.
When I got back with the second load, I saw them throwing the boxes into the lake.
She didn't realize it at the time, but what Ida Weisenbacher witnessed may have been one of the final acts of the biggest bank heists in history. The sheer scale of the Nazis' theft of Europe's treasures was astonishing.
The plunder of Europe was, from the beginning, a part of the Nazi war plan. It was their idea to collect everything which was valuable across Europe.
The Nazis plundered the museums and private collections of the newly occupied countries for priceless works of art.
Hitler was an art fan, and he was fascinated by art, treasures. He collected things. He tried to get hold of ancient paintings, ancient statues by famous painters, by famous artists.
Hitler's deputy, head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Goering, personally amassed a vast collection of looted art and gold, sent to him from across occupied Europe, estimated to have been worth $200 million. But from the beginning, what the Nazis wanted most of all was gold. Gold bars that could be stored in bank vaults and exchanged for foreign currency whenever it was needed.
It started in 1938 with the occupation of Austria. They took the national reserves of Austria the moment they entered Vienna. They continued in Czechoslovakia and went on because what the Nazis, of course, needed was gold.
The Nazis stole $2.5 million worth of gold from Czechoslovakia, $200 million worth of gold from France and Belgium, and later in the war, $30 million from Hungary and $100 million from Italy.
The Nazis stole the gold from the gold reserves of the countries that they conquered. Gold was essential to Hitler. Everybody has the mythical idea that Hitler was and Germany was rolling in money as it is now. But in fact, Germany didn't have enough food to feed its people.
In total, Berlin accumulated $500 million worth of foreign gold, the equivalent of over $36 billion in today's money. Gold fed the Nazi war machine.
They smelted down the gold, they stamped it with fake stamps as if it came from the Prussian mint, and they sent it to Zurich, and the Swiss gave them foreign currency for it.
Swiss banks became complicit in the Nazis' theft of Europe's gold.
An American investigating group determined that of the $400 million, which is a lot of money then, 50 years ago, of the $400 million that was sent to Switzerland from Germany, 300 million of it was stolen.
There is a reason why the Nazis never attacked Switzerland, because it was their banking place. It was their way to shore up their treasures, but it was also their place to do the trade with all sorts of foreign countries.
The Americans and the Allies begged the Swiss to stop taking the gold, and they refused. They continued to take gold until 1945, when the Germans had more or less lost the war.
But there was only so much gold in Europe's banks Hitler and his armies could steal. The SS were instructed to find alternative sources.
They began to run out of gold, so what did they do? They did, as we know, this terrible war crime. Before the Jews were killed in Auschwitz, they pulled the gold out of their mouths, and they melted it down into bars.
The SS stripped concentration camp victims of an estimated $70 million worth of gold teeth and jewelry. But by 1945, as the Allies swept into Germany, some Nazis began to consider the unthinkable. What if they lost? Where would they go? And what would they do with their stolen gold?
The Germans kept these gold bars and other robbed treasures, and particularly art, out of the way of anybody who might have grabbed it.
The Nazi gold was under threat. Hitler instructed the SS to make Berlin's reserves disappear.
They started to move things, to move treasures, to move gold underground in mountain deposits.
But the Americans got wind of Hitler's orders. On the 4th of April 1945, they entered the German town of Merkers and discovered a vast hoard in an abandoned salt mine. Over 8,000 gold bars, worth $240 million.
The 100 tons of gold bullion represents most of Germany's reserve.
They couldn't believe their eyes. They were just blinded by the incredible amount of gold just packed away there.
It wasn't just gold, but over 1 billion German marks, millions in foreign currency, and 400 tons worth of priceless works of art. But it was only part of the stolen hoard. The Allies knew the Nazis were on the run and looking to hide.
One of the best places to do that was Austria, and specifically the mountains of Austria and the Salzkammergut.
Secretly, the Nazis sent freight trains south in the hope of evading the Americans approaching from the west and the Russians from the east.
When those trains rolled into the Salzkammergut, they were just packed up to the top with all sorts of treasures, gold, valuables, paintings, all the Nazis finally could get hold of before they had to leave.
Some of Hitler's most senior generals fled with their loot, including second in command in the SS, Ernst Kaltenbrunner.
Kaltenbrunner, this high-ranking SS criminal, took the stuff he had collected during the years of his career and brought it back here to the Salzkammergut.
Kaltenbrunner took refuge in this house by Lake Toplitz, 16 miles from Lake Toplitz.
Kaltenbrunner tried to contact the Americans because he had these plans to make a separate peace with the Americans.
But when his overtures of negotiation were rejected, Kaltenbrunner fled, but not before burying his loot.
When Kaltenbrunner finally left the Salzkammergut and tried to flee, what he left behind and what was found was gold in his garden. He just simply took cases full of gold and hid them in his garden, and those were dug up in the first weeks after the war.
But it wasn't just Kaltenbrunner burying gold. In the south of Austria, American GIs uncovered over 700 Nazi gold bars buried in a shallow hole in the ground. and the stories of hidden Nazi gold started to percolate throughout the Salzkammergut.
There is eyewitnesses telling you about famous Nazis, just like Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Gestapo, coming here in the final days of the war, riding into the Salzkammergut, together with about 15 officers on motor cars with sidecars, and that they were full of cases with valuables and gold. And they went up to the mountains and didn't come back.
But the majority of the rumors centered on one lake. The same lake that Ida Weisenbacher had witnessed boxes being thrown into. Lake Toplitz.
Toplitz is an absolutely fascinating geological phenomenon. It's a long lake. It's a ravine that's filled in as deep as Big Ben, several hundred feet.
The Nazis knew all about Lake Toplitz. Joseph Goebbels' holiday villa was close by. Because of its 103-meter depth and remote location, from 1943, it had been used as a naval testing station. In its dark waters, the Nazis experimented with underwater explosives and submarines, testing them at different depths. They fired torpedoes from underwater into the lakeside mountain, gouging out large cavities in its canyon walls.
The Germans used it to test new submarine missiles. They tested a submarine missile that eventually became the Polaris missile. So there's a lot of junk at the bottom of that lake. Used ammunition, God knows what.
Lake Toplitz was seen by SS Command as an ideal place to sink the Nazi horde and stop the Allies getting their hands on it. And one day, when things improved, they would return and retrieve it. Eyewitness Ida Weisenbacher still lives just a couple of miles from Lake Toplitz and remembers the day the SS arrived. It's the same house she lived in as a young girl when she was ordered to help them transport heavy boxes to the lake.
I said, are you crazy? Why would you throw them in the lake? No, they had to go in. There was something that didn't belong here anymore.
But precisely what was in the heavy boxes, she did not know. Could they have contained the missing Nazi gold? A week after the SS dumped their load into Lake Toplitz, on the 8th of May 1945, the Nazis surrendered. The Allied nations celebrated victory. But where was all the missing Nazi gold? After the war, as the years went by, the stories of what was thrown into Lake Toplitz grew and grew. Because of what Ida had seen and the reports of buried gold being dug up, everyone seemed to be convinced that there must be gold lying at the bottom of the lake. In the 1950s, local boy Gerhard Zauner grew up on the stories of buried treasure in Toplitz.
As children, we discovered a lot of things that were thrown into the lake after the war. I went to these places hundreds of times. And with your fingers, you go through the silt. Over here, one Nazi bigwig lived, and over there another, and in the lakes they lived next to, you could find things.
In the post-war years, amateur divers attempted to reach the bed of Lake Toplitz to recover its Nazi treasure. But Toplitz is a highly unusual lake. No oxygen exists below 20 meters, so nothing perishes. With its steep, wooded banks, trees fall in and form a false bottom of floating logs, under which, if you get trapped, there's often no way back to the surface. Two German scientists who had worked in the Nazis' naval station during the war drowned when they attempted to get to the bottom of Toplitz. Their deaths only heightened the rumors of what was hidden in the lake. Only now, people said the lake was cursed. In the late 1950s, the stories of gold dumped into Lake Toplitz proved irresistible to one journalist. Working at Germany's biggest-selling magazine, Der Stern, investigative reporter Wolfgang Loerde had reached the top of his profession.
In those days, you always had to be there first and come back with a picture and a story for the magazine. And it was tough having to be the first all the time. It wears you out. I even had a plane at my disposal.
Loerde painstakingly pieced together the story of what happened at Lake Toplitz, collating information gleaned from Nazi documents, local rumors, and even the confessions of former Nazi generals in South America.
At first, I didn't know anything about the gold. I only stumbled upon it when I did some research afterwards into how things had happened.
Based on what he'd discovered, Loerde persuaded his editors to finance the first large-scale exploration of Toplitz, on the grounds that he might just get the scoop of the decade. And it helped that Wolfgang Loerde wasn't just a journalist.
I was in the Navy. I was a naval officer during the war. So I know how to operate underwater.
Toplitz is fed from a smaller lake above and feeds into a larger lake below, which gives it a sequence of unique but dangerous currents. Loerde had to establish exactly how he could navigate the precarious movements of the lake all the way to the bottom, 103 meters down.
I had to calculate with what speed and at what level the lake would move. I did that in the winter of '58 for the first time. The lake was still frozen and was just starting to melt. And this way you can see exactly how the streams from Toplitz develop.
And even if he managed to work out the currents, getting whatever was down there to the surface presented a whole other set of problems. Loerde adapted technology he had used in the Marines.
I did the calculations and then we built ourselves a claw gripper. We had built the gripper in such a way that it opens when it goes down. And then a rope had to be pulled, so it closes when it is down. And when it was closed, we would pull the box up. You learn a lot in the Navy.
de Stern commissioned a fleet of VW Dormobiles to transport Loerder and his team of divers, photographers, and writers to Austria. But it was very much Loerder's story. He would lead the exploration and write daily reports as he went. Loerder attached to the claw gripper lights and a camera, which would relay pictures to the crew on the surface. With the information he had acquired from locals and former Nazis, Loerder had a good idea where the suspected gold had been sunk.
Using my calculations, we eased down the claw gripper, down to the 100 meters depth of the lake.
They scanned the entire lake for 2 weeks and found nothing. But Loerder was determined, and just when they were ready to give up, told his team they had to continue into the darkness.
We searched some more at night, with the camera on the bed of the lake. In the beginning, we didn't find anything. But then through the cable on the monitor, I could see there is something there. At about 11 at night, we saw a box.
Loerder's team could barely contain their excitement. Had they found the missing Nazi gold?
The camera lit up the box. Then the claw gripper came and it picked it up. When it was 2-3 meters from the surface, I stopped. Otherwise, the box would have burst open.
If they dropped the box, Loerder's story would sink with it. He wasn't going to take that risk.
I dived in, tied some rope underwater, and wrapped it around the box. Then I resurfaced and gave them the rope.
But when they brought the box to the surface, no one was sure what was inside. The next morning, the world's media waited with bated breath. Amongst the crowd was local boy Gerhard Zauner, who still remembers the day that changed his life.
For us it was sensational. We all went to Lake Toplitz with our parents to witness the salvation of this treasure. This was a big motivation for me. I had to get down there.
But it wasn't just Zauner and his family who were on tenterhooks to see what was in Loerder's recovered box.
The police came and the public. 80 or 90 people. It was a scrum. Then we pulled the box up. The box burst open. But there wasn't any gold in there.
To the crowd's astonishment, the Stern team hadn't found gold, but millions and millions of pristine British banknotes.
We brought them up, and after 16 or 17 boxes, we thought, this is nonsense. We leave them all down there and tear the lids open underwater, and then we can see if it is gold or... But they were just notes.
It was the beginning of a whole new mystery. What were these pounds? And why had they been sunk in Lake Toplitz? The mystery deepened when it was revealed the pounds weren't quite what they seemed.
Lake Toplitz in Austria, and the end of a long search which for years puzzled Scotland Yard and the international police. Down there at the bottom of the lake are boxes of printing plates and notes, the clue to what must be the biggest forgery of all time.
What Loerder and his Dustern team had discovered wasn't gold, but 73 million pounds worth of perfectly forged banknotes. The equivalent of almost 3 billion pounds in today's money. Just why they were there, nobody knew. But unraveling the mystery of the counterfeit pounds would make Wolfgang Loerder's name.
Loerder was consumed by this the way almost anybody who gets involved with it does. It was a tremendous sensation. He got a lot of publicity and a lot of very good stories.
Over 15 editions, Dustern slowly unpicked the truth behind the mystery of Lake Toplitz. What Loerder had found was evidence of the biggest counterfeiting operation in history.
The idea of counterfeiting British pounds was actually conceived in the first week of the war.
The Nazis' plan was to destabilize the pound as the world's reserve currency and bring the British Empire to its knees. Great Britain would be subsumed into the 1,000-year Reich. The Bank of England was convinced its banknotes were unforgeable. But the German SS had other ideas. Its head, Heinrich Himmler, was in charge of the plan. And he had just the person to put it into practice. An SS officer with a background in engineering and a speciality in forging passports had come to Himmler's attention. His name was Bernhard Krüger. Himmler told Krüger he would even name the operation after him, Operation Bernhard. It was an offer Krüger couldn't refuse. Krüger was instructed by Himmler to use Jewish counterfeiters and artists to make his pounds. Many of them were already at the Nazis' disposal.
Krüger went to Auschwitz, saying, please have everybody, any one of your Jewish prisoners who speaks German and is connected with the graphic arts, just pull their names out and get them ready. And he assembled, over a period of about a year or two, 140 Jewish prisoners in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp just north of Berlin, which was actually the headquarters of all the concentration camps.
Krüger then had to decide which pound note was the easiest for his Sachsenhausen team to forge.
They decided to print 5-pound notes, big, impressive 5-pound notes, black and white notes, easy to print. This man was a very meticulous engineer by training, and he got plates that were sent by the Reichsbank's engravers, and they adjusted these plates with all of the special secret markings that the British put on the pounds.
They wanted to make really perfect pound notes. Those pound notes, of course, were part of their plans They were supposed to be used for international finance.
Wolfgang Loeder's De Stern articles revealed that in September 1942, the first Sachsenhausen-produced forged pounds had made their way into circulation over the Channel. They were technically brilliant, almost undetectable. The Bank of England declared them the most dangerous forgeries they'd ever seen. Soon, a flood of forged pounds were appearing, used by the Nazis to buy weapons and yet more gold. The Nazi plan was working. Sterling began to lose value. But Himmler and the SS had bigger ideas.
They came up with this crazy idea that if they print millions of fake pounds and drop them over England, that the British economy would just blow up and collapse.
Himmler wanted Goering's Luftwaffe to airdrop the forgeries over Britain, rendering the pound worthless. They certainly had enough forgeries. Between 1942 and 1945, the Sachsenhausen counterfeiters produced 134 million fake pounds.
That represents roughly 13% of the billion pounds in circulation throughout the world.
The pound was becoming a suspect currency. Nobody knew which were real and which were the Führer's forgeries.
This was the greatest counterfeit in history. Captain Kruger, who was in charge of this, boasted quite correctly after the war, "I am the greatest counterfeiter in history," which he was. There's nothing even near it.
But Himmler's idea of a huge airdrop was never realized. The Germans were losing the war. The Luftwaffe simply didn't have enough planes to put the idea into practice. As the Allies approached in 1945, Kruger knew his life and that of his counterfeiters had little meaning to his boss, Heinrich Himmler, who was desperately trying to hide evidence of his appalling crimes.
Kruger realized that not only when the thing was shut down that the Jews would get killed, but he, as the bearer of a state secret, probably would get killed too. So the interests of both the SS major and the Jews began to converge.
Kruger ordered his men to escape and burn all the evidence of his extraordinary counterfeiting operation. The trouble was, burning millions of pounds was more difficult than Kruger realized.
Why didn't they just destroy them? The point is, they did try to destroy a number of them. They had orders to burn them and leave not a trace of any pound in the ashes. And they buried the ashes.
But there were just too many pounds to destroy. So Kruger sent a unit with forgeries boxed in weighted, waterproof crates, each weighing 200 pounds, to the Salzkammergut. Their destination was Lake Toplitz, as proved by Wolfgang Loeder, who pulled them to the surface in 1959.
The intelligence service of the SS, in cahoots with high-level experts, brought the boxes to the Toplitz in Austria. I knew that the boxes were thrown into Toplitz, and I knew who threw them in.
Loeder revealed that the SS unit were told very specifically to attempt to find a way of retrieving the boxes after the war.
They take the coffins full of counterfeit pounds and they sink them in the lake, but not completely, because each one of those coffins is attached to a rope.
Und dann wurden diese Kisten
These boxes were tied up to wooden floats with a rope and thrown into the water.
und ins Wasser geschmissen. Und ein Bild ist auch da.
And in one of the pictures, a little boy, my son, is pulling the float with a rope attached to it.
The ropes from the boxes were attached to logs that would float and indicate where they had been sunk. That way, the SS believed they would one day return and reclaim their sunken loot. Once Loerder had discovered the truth, the Austrian government, on instructions from the Bank of England, destroyed Kruger's pounds. But such was the scale of the counterfeiting operation. Today, there are almost 3 times more counterfeits than originals left in existence.
To me, the profound irony of the pounds is that the real fakes, and there are some fake fakes actually, that is people trying to cash in on it, the real fakes which fetch, 10s, 20s, 30s, 50 pounds, far more valuable than their face value, sometimes 100 pounds if they're good ones in good condition.
But had Wolfgang Loerder unraveled the mystery of Lake Toplitz once and for all? Were the stories of sunken gold just stories after all? Questions remained. If Toplitz only contained forged pounds, what was in the heavier boxes, as seen by Ida Weisenbacher that day the SS arrived at her door? Could they have contained gold?
Stimmt.
Absolutely, absolutely. All these boxes haven't been taken out. I'm convinced. There were these small, heavy boxes with the handles. I don't know, but maybe there was gold in there. The gold must be really deep down.
It's not such a far-fetched idea. Even the man who found the forged pounds in Lake Toplitz is convinced another unit of SS officers were responsible for the disposal of Nazi gold.
There was a different group that transported boxes with gold to Austria. There are probably gold boxes down there. They're still there. The place can still be found today. I can even show you on a photo.
Loerder's convinced this photograph, taken by a naval officer at the time, shows pounds being thrown into the lake in the foreground, but gold being sunk in the back. The rumors of sunken gold remain so strong that in 1963, 4 years after de Stern's revelations, a young diver from Munich drowned looking for it. Whilst searching for the body, the Austrian government mounted the first official exploration of the lake. They pulled to the surface equipment from Sachsenhausen and yet more counterfeit pounds, but no gold. After that, the authorities introduced a ban on all underwater explorations of Toplitz, which still exists today. But that didn't stop one man, Gerhard Zauner, who as a boy had witnessed Wolfgang Loerder raising the forged pounds from the depths all those years ago.
It is my world. It is my favorite lake because historically it's the hottest.
Zauner has dived for gold and other treasures more times than anyone else in the Salzkammergut. He's pulled so much Nazi memorabilia from the bottom of the Austrian lakes, he's even opened his own museum.
We've had bayonets, rifles, handguns, hypodermic needles, 3 big round mines. One of them is in the restaurant at Toplitz.
But Zauner never discovered gold until 1987. On the 1st of April, Zauner pulled from the depths 14 perfectly preserved gold bars. Gerhard Zauner, the local dive enthusiast, had raised the Nazi gold. Finally, someone had found it. But all was not as it seemed.
We had a very unpleasant policeman who examined my car's tires. They were worn out. He made me pay the maximum fine. But he was actually right. And we thought we were going to do a prank on him. So we had gold bars made and we sank them.
It was all just an April Fool's joke by Zauner to get back at his local policeman.
We said it wasn't gold, but the police said it was, as it was heavy. They took it away, and after 3 days they found out it wasn't gold after all. No one knows the policeman's real name now. Everyone just calls him Goldfinger.
Even today, Zauner's hoax hasn't stopped the stories of Nazi gold in Lake Toplitz from persisting.
There are so many funny stories the Austrians tell about it, because they say there's all these nutty Americans and British coming to Lake Toplitz and we're just making jokes with them.
Any story that says, look, there's gold in them thar hills or them thar lakes is going to attract people who'll say, let me go after it and look for it. Because after all, if you find it, you've hit the jackpot.
The mystery of what really lies at the bottom of the devil's dustbin may never be solved.
Today, Toplitz is a bit of a secret. It doesn't want to show all it's got, does it?
One thing is for sure, there's large amounts of gold and other valuables in the Salzkammergut that have not been found.
Unearthed from the searing deserts of the Middle East, an ancient text told of hidden treasures. One man believed it was a list of gold and silver plundered from one of the great marvels of the ancient world, the Second Temple of Jerusalem.
It's really absolutely the kind of treasure list you would expect to find in a fiction book about a treasure.
If the text was true, it promised the greatest riches in history.
The treasure described in the Copper Scroll must have been temple treasure.
But the Copper Dead Sea Scroll has baffled experts and treasure hunters alike. Some said it was fake.
Is the treasure real, or is it a fabulous kind of fairy story?
The British scholar John Allegro was determined to get to the truth. It was a quest that would cost him nearly everything.
He was in the wilderness, literally in the wilderness.
But nothing would stop him in his search.
John Allegro was always up for an adventure.
That adventure would change his life forever. This is the story of John Allegro's quest to unravel the mysteries of the Copper Dead Sea Scroll. The story of the Copper Dead Sea Scroll began with a chance discovery on the shores of the Dead Sea in what was then Jordan in 1947. A young Bedouin shepherd, looking for his goat among the high cliffs, had come across a cave. In the dark void, he discovered tall earthenware jars containing rolls of parchment wrapped in cloth. These were the first of the fabled Dead Sea Scrolls, dating back almost to the time of Christ, the oldest biblical texts ever found. So precious, they were priceless.
The Dead Sea Scrolls are texts written in Hebrew, Aramaic, a few in Greek, from the time of Jesus. They contain copies of books of the Bible, which are 1,000 years earlier than any copy we had before. They fill in a gap in our knowledge, and they enable us to discover the roots of both Christianity and Judaism. They are fantastically important.
The Bedouin were quick to realize the value of their find, and a frenzy of scroll hunting began.
The number of items that came out of the caves was enormous, maybe 87,000 different fragments, representing about 940 different individual scrolls.
In Jerusalem, scholars were desperate to preserve the fragments, so they bought the scrolls from eager Bedouin, selling the precious manuscript parchment at high prices.
With the Dead Sea Scrolls, we've suddenly got an enormous quantity of Hebrew and Aramaic literature from the time of Jesus.
The Dead Sea Scroll fragments offered a tantalizing glimpse dating back some 2,000 years. But translating the ancient texts needed a crack team of scholars. In charge of the mission was a Catholic organization, the French École Biblique, run by its most senior priest, Father Roland Deveau. He put out an urgent call to the world's finest biblical scholars. At the University of Oxford, the request was put to a talented PhD student, John Allegro. He was no bookish academic. He was a man who had once faced the worst of human nature. Allegro had left school at 16 and joined the British Navy, where he served as an officer during the Second World War. After the conflict, he immersed himself in history, studying the original languages of the Bible, Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic.
He'd been one of the top students, both at undergraduate and at master's degree level in Manchester, and had gone to Oxford to study for his doctorate.
When the call came from Deveau, Allegro couldn't pass up the chance to study the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were true biblical mysteries he could unravel.
What fascinated him mainly was the sense that these tiny scraps of ancient material had last been handled by men scribbling down what they believed. It was the link, the personal link over nearly 2,000 years of the people who wrote them that brought the whole thing to life for him.
In 1953, he flew to Israel, a journey that would change his life. Allegro knew he and his colleagues were working on one of the most important discoveries of the millennium. But one scroll in particular caught Allegro's eye. Unlike all the others, it was not made of papyrus.
The copper scroll is made of very well-refined copper.
This strange copper scroll was discovered in 1952 in a cave located along a small area on the shores of the Dead Sea, known as Qumran. The cave's roof had collapsed, but amongst the rubble at the back, the copper scroll had been found in two pieces. It was inscribed on the inside with an ancient script. Everything about it was a puzzle.
Why was this text inscribed on copper in the first place? Copper, which is extremely refined. It's nearly 100% pure copper.
The technology of making it was not really known widely in that period. And there are serious questions as to how they could actually be able to do it.
Yet while the actual copper seemed advanced, the writing on the scroll was primitive.
It seems to be the case that the Hebrew letters are rather poorly formed. It's quite difficult to read.
However, the few words Allegro could make out stunned him.
He looked at the outside, read it from the outside and said, that's treasure list.
Allegro couldn't believe his eyes. It seemed he was looking at the answer to one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. In AD 70, the Romans sacked Jerusalem and ransacked the Second Temple. The temple was the holiest place in the Jewish faith. Built on the site of the fabled Temple of Solomon, it was filled with vast treasures accumulated over centuries.
Some of the treasure is gold and silver. Some of it is pottery and other artifacts, the possessions of the high priest.
The precious items that were in the temple at Jerusalem would have been of enormous value, huge amounts.
The Romans looted, plundered, and destroyed it. Some of what they stole can be seen to this day, depicted on the triumphal arch of Titus in Rome.
You can see a huge menorah, which is the seven-branched candlestick that would have been standing in front of the ark. There were trumpets, there were other chests of, obviously, things taken by the Romans back to Rome.
Folklore says the gold and silver was used to pay for the building of the Colosseum. But some believe that the Romans didn't steal all the treasure, that part of it was hidden away by the temple priests. Could Allegro be looking at a 2,000-year-old treasure map that might lead him to one of the greatest discoveries of all time? But frustratingly, he couldn't unravel the scroll. It seemed that 2,000 years of corrosion ensured its secrets would remain secure.
When it was discovered, the copper had become completely oxidized, that is, extremely brittle. So scholars recognized immediately that should they try to open it by unrolling it, it would simply disintegrate.
All sorts of solutions were proposed to open the copper scroll.
A number of really quite ridiculous suggestions were put forward. One, for instance, was that you could reduce the copper in hydrogen, but the whole thing would have just disintegrated and you'd been left with nothing.
That turned out to be one of the more sensible ideas.
Another absurd attempt was the idea that you could use electrolysis to reduce the copper back from its oxidized state into its metallic state. Absolute metallurgically nonsense.
Numerous methods were considered, but all were rejected. There seemed to be no way of retrieving the scroll's tantalizing secrets. But Allegro refused to be beaten, and he believed he had the answer.
Allegro was the kind of character that wouldn't just say, yes, it'd be a nice idea if we could open it, wouldn't it? He very definitely would say, well, how are we going to open it? Let's do it.
He was now lecturing at Manchester University, which boasted one of the finest engineering departments in the world. The challenge would be a golden opportunity for them. But their response took him by surprise.
Allegro's head of department in Manchester was very determined that the reputation of the University of Manchester should not be put at risk by something going disastrously wrong with this scroll.
Refused by his own university, he turned to the nearby Manchester Institute of Technology. The head of department, Professor H. Wright Baker, embraced the opportunity and proposed a radical solution.
Professor H. Wright Baker was one of the top mechanical engineers, certainly in England and probably in the world. He came up with something that no one had actually applied before, as far as I know, to heavily corroded materials.
Baker's plan was to coat the scroll with strong epoxy resin to stop it disintegrating. Then he would cut through the top layer of the metal scroll, slicing it from one end to the other, cutting away a single section of scroll at a time.
He had a little circular blade which would cut just 1 millimeter, straight line.
After each cut, he'd rotate the scroll to cut and peel away another section.
The trick also, of course, was to try to cut in places where there wasn't any writing.
He began the job in the utmost secrecy. Baker was so nervous about making the first slice and destroying the precious scroll that he went ahead without even telling Allegro.
Wright Baker wouldn't let anybody except himself witness the first cut, just in case something terrible went wrong.
He would, I think, have been absolutely scared that he was going to be the one responsible for destroying the copper scroll.
On October the 1st, 1955, he made the first cut. It took just 10 minutes. In the following days, Baker made the remaining slices.
In the cutting open of the scroll, only one letter of Hebrew was actually lost. This is quite remarkable. Wright Baker did as fine a job as anybody in the world could have done.
And so Allegro became the first man to see the scroll's ancient text, revealed for the first time in almost 2 millennia.
To see the inside of the scroll revealed to the air the first time for nearly 2,000 years was exciting, astonishing.
He immediately set to work, decoding it.
Deciphering the copper scroll was extremely difficult. There were terms that people had never seen before.
And soon, he found a further mystery. The script had been written by several different people.
It seemed that the scribe, or in fact scribes, because I think they found at least 3, if not 4, different hands been at it, could possibly not have really understood what they were copying.
Allegro reasoned that using several scribes, each writing just a small section, would be the best way to keep the treasure secret, as none of them could learn the full story of where it was hidden.
See, they were probably copying off some parchment scroll, some writing, but had just been told to put it down, engrave it on this sheet of metal without knowing what it was about.
As he translated the copper scroll, Allegro began to realize that it identified several different locations in Judea. Why? What was their significance?
He thought he recognised from the topography of the Qumran area references within the copper scroll to places like the Great Wadi and a fissure in the rock which had been caused by an earthquake which was well attested in, I think, 31 BC. Flights of steps, tunnels. It all seemed to make sense from what he knew of the archaeological sites around Qumran.
But critically, the more Allegro studied the scroll, the more certain he became that there was only one place the riches it described could have come from.
The treasure described in the copper scroll must have been temple treasure. He couldn't think where else would have had such a wealth of gold coins, tithe vessels, and gold bars, silver bars, precious metals, precious stones.
Because the treasure was so precious, Allegro believed that whoever had hidden it had created an inventory which had been scribed onto extremely pure copper, soft enough to roll.
It was not normal to be engraving on copper at that period in history, Second Temple period. There wasn't copper of that purity available to actually do the engraving, and the fabrication techniques they were using were quite unique. It's a one-off.
Unlike papyrus or parchment, the scroll was made to last, possibly for hundreds of years, awaiting a time when it was safe to recover the treasure. Allegro now put two and two together. If the stories were true that the temple priests had managed to hide some of the treasure, then the locations he had translated had to be a list of the places it had been hidden. For safekeeping, it must have been spread out.
Once he'd initially translated the first few parts of it, became a real obsession for John.
He realized this was telling you exactly where the treasure was, and if you could find the place, you should be able to find the treasure.
The scroll's text was written in columns. Each listed a series of locations with the precise quantities and weights of the treasure to be found within. In the first column, Allegro read 40 cubits under the steps, entering to the east, a money chest and its contents of a weight of 17 talents. And then, in the tomb of the queen, buried at 12 cubits, 9 talents.
It's really absolutely the kind of treasure list that you would expect to find in a fiction book about a treasure. There it is, you go, dig, 5 paces to the left, down you go, 5 meters, and boom, boom, there it is. So it really is absolutely the perfect treasure list.
Allegro sent his translation to Father Roland de Vaux, the man in charge of the Dead Sea Scrolls project.
He waited for the telegram coming back saying, "This is absolutely great, fantastic, you've done a wonderful job. We're having a press conference tomorrow. We'll tell them all about this treasure. How exciting."
But the answer was not at all what he expected.
The reaction from Roland de Vaux was, don't tell anyone. If it's treasure, we don't want anyone to know about it. Keep it completely under your hat.
The fact was that de Vaux simply didn't believe the treasures described by the copper scroll were real. nor did his most trusted expert, Father Joseph Milik.
Devoe certainly was sceptical about the reality of the treasure, and he'd appointed Joseph Milik to be the official editor of the Copper Scroll.
Milik, his first reaction was that the scroll was a work of fiction and of imagination and was not to be taken seriously.
Unlike Allegro, Milik and Devoe felt that the sheer amounts of gold described in the scroll couldn't possibly be genuine.
It was the gold and the silver that was most astonishing because of the apparent quantities it was in.
The units of weight that they were using was a talent, which is about 35 kilograms, 72 pounds, which is a huge weight. They were coming up with totals of 65 tons of silver and 25 tons of gold.
If the scroll weights were correct, it listed a quarter of all the known gold in the world at the time and all of the known silver. It made no sense, though Allegro thought he had an answer.
Allegro was obviously stumped by the huge weights, and he did actually suggest that the talent, that the weight unit they were using might well be 1/60th of the biblical talent, and that would have given much more reasonable amounts of treasure.
Devoe and Milik had another problem. All the other Dead Sea Scrolls were written on parchment. Why was this the only one engraved in copper? However, Allegro argued that this just added to the scroll's credibility.
John Allegro was convinced that the treasure was real because the scroll was made of copper. It wasn't parchment or papyrus. Who would be writing such a fairy tale on copper?
But was it just that? A 2,000-year-old fairy tale? Devoe and Milik's doubts threw the whole credibility of both the scroll and Allegro into question.
This was his baby. He'd gone to all the trouble to get it open, and now he was not only being denied any of the spoils of his triumph, he was kind of being pushed aside, put out of the picture. He obviously resented it. Must have done.
Despite their reservations, the École Biblique did agree to unravel the full text of the scroll. So in 1956, the second, larger section was sent to H. Wright Baker's laboratory. Once opened, Allegro translated the text and sent it to Jerusalem as before. This time, Devoe didn't even believe he deserved a rejection letter. Allegro heard nothing from him at all.
Suddenly, he found he was getting a very chilly reception indeed. He gathered that everything had changed. In fact, everything had been poisoned for him in Jerusalem.
Convinced it was a fake, Devoe refused to let Allegro publish anything about the Copper Scroll.
He was regarded as somebody who couldn't be trusted to keep quiet, that wanted to go out and tell everybody what he was finding in the scrolls.
Allegro protested, demanding to be heard. The reaction from Devoe was swift and decisive. Allegro was ostracized.
Wright Baker had been told he wasn't to be trusted, therefore he wasn't even allowed in the lab or in the lectures. He was threatened with not having his contract renewed, which would mean losing his job.
Relations were then extremely strained. They virtually condemned his career to the wilderness. His career went downhill, His health went downhill, and psychologically he was really, really damaged. It's almost as if they were saying your work has been useless.
Allegro returned to his base at Manchester University. There he waited patiently for years to be allowed to publish his own account of the Copper Dead Sea Scroll. Then in 1959, out of the blue, Devoe's lead scholar, Father Joseph Milik, published his official translation of the scroll.
They said it was a collection of fabulous treasure, so fabulous that it could only be fictional. End of story. And he knew perfectly well that wasn't so. He couldn't believe that they really, really believed that.
He was very upset, particularly because he didn't agree with a lot of the wording of Milik's translation.
It was now a matter of public record. The scroll to which he had dedicated so much of his professional life was a fake. Allegro was outraged.
Allegro had played the game up to that time. He hadn't published anything before Milik had had a chance to put his ideas first.
He was bursting to tell everybody about this. He'd gone to so much trouble to get it deciphered. He had been very patient. He had waited. I think he had any amount of frustration just built up. And he couldn't wait any longer, so he published.
So against Devoe's orders, he wrote his own account. News of the treasure was an instant hit.
The book sold very well and very widely. It stirred the public imagination with the Dead Sea Scrolls once again.
And Allegro didn't just publish a book. He was going to mount an expedition. He would go out into the desert to prove the scroll was real and find the treasure himself.
He was sure of his readings of the scroll, that it was real and factual and not fiction.
All he needed was backers.
He could not rely on his colleagues in Jerusalem. He could not rely on the Jordanian Department of Antiquities. He could not rely on the University of Manchester. It was down to him.
So Allegro cranked up his publicity machine, seeking backers from the press and public. The Daily Mail newspaper stepped up and part-sponsored his expedition. It even sent its star correspondent, Ralph Izzard, to cover the story. With millions of readers now following his every move, the pressure began to mount. Allegro now had to find the fabled treasure.
I'm sure that Allegro had mixed feelings about the presence of the Daily Mail. On the one hand, he must have loved the idea that there was going to be this kind of coverage. On the other hand, I think he should have felt under pressure to find something really exciting because it was in the glare of publicity.
The pressure was all the greater because he now had much of the Jordanian army at his disposal, courtesy of his second sponsor, King Hussein of Jordan.
King Hussein recognized the huge significance of the Dead Sea Scroll material.
The king personally supported Allegro's quest and mobilized his forces on the ground.
King Hussein gave help with making the Royal Jordanian Army landing craft and overland vehicles, and also helicopter support available, which was extremely useful in ferrying supplies out to the camps.
Allegro recruited a band of skilled but amateur enthusiasts. Archaeologists, architects, surveyors, technicians, and a cameraman to photograph the terrain described by the Copper Scroll. With the world watching, they set off to make camp in the Jordanian desert. Allegro's first destination, the ancient ruin of Khirbet Mird in the Vale of Akkor, known 2,000 years ago as Hyrcania. It was a fortress that Allegro believed was once the palace of King Herod of Judea when the scroll was made. Allegro's translation told him that 40 cubits, about 18 meters, under some steps, entering to the east, lay a money chest, its contents weighing 17 talents, nearly 2 kilos. And incredibly, they found something. In the rock face, the team discovered a shaft, a flight of stone stairs that led to an underground, vaulted room. The location, as described in the copper scroll, existed. It was real. But vandals had wrecked the site. Marble columns and mosaic tiles had been hacked to pieces. And any treasure that had been hidden there had vanished. And then it got even worse. When Allegro and his team went back to camp to lick their wounds, their disappointment was quickly swept away by terror. A powerful storm hit Allegro's camp. It flattened their tents, wrecked their stores, and they lost all their precious water. There was a real chance they could die in the desert. But luckily, Allegro's friend, King Hussein, had been keeping a close eye on the expedition.
In the morning when the storm had died down, they found the Royal Jordanian Army trucks on their way, bringing fresh water supplies, fresh equipment, and helping to get them established again and peg them down a bit more firmly on the rock for the next time.
Disaster averted, Allegro's next stop was Khirbet Qumran, an ancient settlement about a mile inland from the northeast shore of the Dead Sea.
The Copper Scroll does mention as one of the hiding places of treasure a place called Sakaka. And Sakaka is quite possibly the name of Qumran itself. And many of the places mentioned in the Copper Scroll do seem to point to the Qumran area.
Khirbet Qumran had been home to the Essene Jewish sect, who'd written and hidden the Dead Sea Scrolls in the local caves. If the scrolls had survived untouched for 2 millennia, perhaps the treasure was untouched too. In fact, coins had been found in the area only a few years before.
A hoard of silver shekels had been discovered, and this had led some people to think that maybe the Copper Scroll described the rest of the Essene treasure.
3 juglets of silver coins which seem to be referred to within the Copper Scroll. And if the Romans or the Bedouin or anybody else who looted the place had happened to miss these 3 juglets of silver coins, who knows what else they might have missed.
Allegro's team swept the site with metal detectors. The occasional ping of the machines raised their hopes. But in fact, the sensors were being triggered by the natural magnetism of the rocks. By now, press from around the world were following Allegro's treasure hunt. They needed a story.
They had expected to have to fight his way through a throng of journalists every time he stepped outside. They were after pictures of him finding treasure.
Allegro then searched a concealed cave, high in the cliff face. He found bones and pottery dating from 400 BC. But no treasure. The press would have to wait. Allegro had found the locations mentioned in the Copper Scroll, but its treasures still eluded him. Undaunted, he pushed on to Jerusalem. First, he dug in what he believed was the tomb of Zadok, the priest of Solomon's first temple. He followed the clues in the scroll, and sure enough, he found a tomb. But again, no treasure. But he had one final plan. A few miles away lay the Temple Mount. This is a sacred place to three major religions. To Jews, it is the site of the now destroyed temple. To Muslims, it is from where the prophet was taken to heaven. And to Christians, it is the place where Christ was buried, the Holy Sepulchre. Because of its extraordinary religious sensitivity, no one is allowed to dig there. But Allegro was determined to try. Allegro had heard that beneath the dome of the rock, there was a labyrinth of passages and chambers. The scroll mentioned 24 sites within the temple area. Maybe the temple treasure had been hidden underneath where it had once stood. Allegro tried to get permission from the Jordanian Antiquities Office and seemed to be getting somewhere.
He filled in forms for here, forms for there, forms for the next person. He waited and waited.
But at the last minute, the authorities refused.
He could not get permission to go where he really wanted to go, which was to the chambers that were known to exist, a whole system of cisterns and chambers and tunnels underneath the Dome of the Rock.
Despite his friendship with King Hussein, the army denied him access.
The authorities were very reluctant to let anybody interfere with what the Temple Mount, let alone an individual enthusiast like Allegro. Allegro never really had a chance at the Dome of the Rock.
Privately, Allegro suspected the hand of his old nemesis, Roland de Vaux.
He didn't have hard and fast evidence. It was just a suspicion due to the fact that they published some article which sounded as if it was rather rejoicing in the fact that the Allegro expedition hadn't been allowed to go very far, which made him think that they'd had something to do with stopping him.
Allegro was more frustrated than ever.
In Khirbet Mird, Allegro found nothing, and in Jerusalem he also found nothing. That is, of course, he found nothing where he was actually allowed to look.
But for all his despair, Allegro's expeditions had not been a total failure.
They found very little in the way of actual treasure. They found possibilities. They're enough to confirm John's readings of the Copper Scroll, the places where there were likely to have been deposits laid.
Allegro may not have found any treasure, but he had found the sites listed in the Copper Scroll. That at least suggested that he was onto something. Not long after, Allegro received news of a breakthrough. A Bedouin friend had found secret caves that might hold the precious temple treasure. Back in Manchester, he went into fundraising mode once more. A year later, he'd raised enough money to return to the desert. His new destination was a place dubbed Christmas Cave, an area that was relatively unexplored.
There had not really been an adequate survey of all the caves in the region, so he thought that he needed to begin somewhere. And Christmas Cave, which is the other side of the wadi from Qumran, seemed like an excellent place to start.
Allegro now set up camp on the southernmost shores of the Dead Sea. And this time he'd brought a huge and diverse group of adventure seekers.
The hard work would be done by local Arabs, but he also was open-minded enough to take with him some student teachers. He used their enthusiasm to match his own as he set out on his quest.
Joining the archaeologists and surveyors were a dozen female students.
It still was pretty unusual for young women to join expeditions to places where there were absolutely no facilities of any sort, living in tents, no running water, no water at all except what was found in the pools and the wadis, absolutely no toilet facilities. But it was a big adventure and they coped extremely well.
Allegro focused on 3 locations: Christmas Cave, a complex in a high cliff accessible only by helicopter; a stone ruin at Mazin, the location of a 1st century BC military base possibly used by Jewish rebels resisting the Romans; and Ein Feshka, with its nearby honeycomb-like warren of caves. Once again, King Hussein lent his support, forcing his government to fast-track excavation licenses, whilst airlifting the equipment into camp. Soon Allegro and his trusted team could set off for Christmas Cave.
They wormed their way inside, and it was very dark and full of bats, and they didn't think it was going anywhere, but the tunnel went on and on.
The cave had already produced Roman period oil lamps and jugs of silver coins from Byzantine times. Surely there could be more. But weeks of search proved fruitless. The explorations to Mazin and to the caves near Ein Feshka also turned up nothing. Then on Christmas Day, the pressure on Allegro reached a new level. King Hussein visited the camp.
The king took a personal interest in what was going on in this particular expedition and came on Christmas Day to visit the expedition.
Did John Allegro feel under pressure when the king arrived in the helicopter and greeted them all on Christmas Day? I think he should have felt under pressure, and a normal person would have done.
But all Allegro could point to was a few Roman coins and artifacts, dating back to around 70 AD, the time the Romans plundered the Second Temple.
I think as a treasure hunt, it was unsuccessful. As an adventure, it was an extraordinary story.
But for Allegro, adventure was not enough. He had given a decade of his life to unraveling the mysteries of the Copper Scroll. He'd been vilified, his career almost ruined, and he'd taken great risks to search for the hiding place of the ancient treasure. But finally, reluctantly, Allegro called time on his last expedition. He had failed to find any treasure listed in the Copper Scroll. John Marco Allegro, died in 1988. He went to the grave almost alone in the belief that the Copper Dead Sea Scroll was authentic. But today, most scholars believe it really is a treasure map, giving directions to real treasures.
His translation work is admirable. He was right. He was right about the fact that the Copper Scroll is a genuine document, and virtually every scholar today accepts that.
John Allegro has been vindicated.
But if it is genuine, where is the treasure?
I suspect that the Romans, who would have known that the temple treasures would have contained some gold and silver, possibly they tortured those they captured and secured some of the items.
And they're not the only ones who might have looted the temple's riches.
It doesn't seem to me unlikely that after 2,000 years of Bedouin roaming around, that treasure might have been found, but we didn't know about it.
And that sadly is the probable truth. In the intervening 2,000 years, it's very likely everyone's taken their share.
The questions remain, no answers, just more questions.
But there is one other possibility. A small section of the Copper Scroll tells of another scroll, hidden in a tunnel in northern Kolit, containing further secrets of buried temple treasure. But the location of Kolit remains a mystery, and that means that at least some of the treasure could still be out there.